Given how much I like to make analytical video essays on media, it should come as no surprise that I've wanted to talk about Bojack Horseman for quite some time. Heck, the only reason it's taken me this long is pretty much because this show gives me so much to talk about that it was hard to decide what topic to choose first. For anyone unfamiliar, Bojack Horseman is an animated adult Netflix series set in a world of anthropomorphic animals and follows a horse named Bojack who used to star in a hit 90s sitcom, but has since become a washed-up alcoholic celebrity dealing with the depressing reality of his life. I cannot stress this enough, underneath this surreal premise and comedy of the series lies one of the darkest, most serious shows I've ever watched. And as I say, it covers a lot of pretty heavy topics from addiction to depression to the sheer hollowness of celebrity lifestyle and culture. Today, however, I want to talk about a single episode. Well, it's not exactly just a single episode since it has a lot of context built up from previous episodes, but nonetheless, the focus of this video that I'd like to talk about today is the episode Free Churro. Free Churro is undoubtedly one of the most experimental episodes the show has ever produced. While there are other surreal and strange episodes that could take the title, Free Churro is an episode built around, well, minimalism and simplicity. The entire episode, aside from the opening scene, takes place at a funeral and is solely dedicated to Bojack's eulogy to his dead mother, Beatrice Horseman. And to understand the meaning behind Free Churro, well, let's discuss Beatrice's story. The earlier seasons of Bojack Horseman showed Beatrice as a cold, neglectful, unfeeling mother, in many ways responsible for Bojack growing up into a depressed alcoholic. Season 4, however, finally gave some insight into Beatrice's backstory and what made her grow so hateful and bitter. Born into a traditional nuclear American family, even though on the surface all seemed fine, the truth was that from the very beginning, things weren't as perfect as they seemed, as father Joseph Sugarman is implied to be cheating on his wife Honey with his secretary, and both parents have a pretty misogynistic, body-shaming parenting style when it comes to their young daughter. The dream truly fell apart, however, when Beatrice's older brother Crackerjack was killed during the war, sending Honey spiralling into a deep depression that her emotional traditionalist husband was not willing to pull her out of. Instead, he attempted to have her cured using, well, the usual method used on mentally ill people in the early 20th century.
Operation?
What's broken in the heart can never be repaired, but the brain, well, we have all sorts of science for the brain.
And upon finding out what happened to her mother, Beatrice makes a promise to Honey that more or less explains her entire character.
Love does things to a person. Terrible things. Beatrice, promise me you'll never love anyone as much as I loved Crackerjack.
I promise. I won't.
Beatrice grew up with a sexist, unemotional father and an empty shell of a mother, and became traumatized after her father burned her beloved childhood doll due to it being infected with germs, then commanded her not to be emotional about it lest she end up just like her mother. Growing up, Beatrice had a chance of a decent life with the son of her father's business colleague, but instead chose to sleep with rebellious, aspiring writer Butterscotch Horseman. Getting pregnant, she decided to try to make things work with Butterscotch, and in doing so, made possibly the biggest mistake of her life, as the two of them gradually realised they were not compatible. Butterscotch proved he was basically a narcissist with delusions of grandeur, and Beatrice failed to develop any real maternal feelings towards her son, growing bitter and resentful and, above all else, extremely neglectful. In her eyes, she was trapped in a relationship with a cruel, uncaring husband and a son she never really wanted, so she took it out on her child. Free Churro begins with a flashback to Bojack as a teenager, being picked up extremely late after soccer practice by his father. And Butterscotch proceeds to summarise exactly how he's a terrible parent in just a short monologue, making the situation entirely about him, acting like he's the one who's been wronged, never once apologising or even acknowledging that he should have picked up his son, throwing in a good deal of sexism and homophobia, then acting like he's taught Bojack a life lesson and demanding he thank him for it. It's an interesting scene to feature given this episode is about Beatrice and not Butterscotch, but on closer inspection it is, if anything, foreshadowing of what's to come, as Butterscotch, who of course has the same voice actor as Bojack, spends the whole scene monologuing about Beatrice and his distaste for her, but it also features possibly the only time he's ever said anything genuinely kind towards her, as he tries to see things from her perspective, much like how Bojack tries during his eulogy. And, of course, it's a scene where Beatrice isn't there for Bojack when he truly needed her. The real story of the episode begins with Bojack talking about how he visited a restaurant and was offered a free churro by the server after he mentioned to her that his mother just died. We realise in this moment that this is Beatrice's funeral. She was clearly in poor health last season, but this is the first time we're hearing of her death. Last season, Bojack tried to let go of his grudge against his mother and move on, but this episode proves that some things just aren't that easy. Bojack attempts to come up with some kind things to say about his mother, but he has to resort to simply inventing an interesting story. He is honest about it though, stating how, in truth, he has no heartwarming stories to tell about her, aside from two. The first is her last words to him as she was dying, those being, "I see you," which he ponders the meaning of, only to later realise she might have just been reading the intensive care unit sign. The second is a story about how his mother would throw fancy parties where she would perform a dance in front of the guests, and how beautiful he'd always thought it looked, and how for one brief moment it made his bitter, cynical mother truly look free. There's something to note here, and that's that during this scene, some old-timey music starts to play. In a later episode, we see a flashback to the first time Bojack can remember drinking. It's one of the bleakest scenes in the entire series, as child Bojack walks into the aftermath of a party to find his parents sleeping, as that same music is playing on an old record player. He looks a little shifty, then takes a drink from a vodka bottle, though doesn't gag or choke, implying this may not be the real first time he's ever drank. As he does, he snuggles up to an unconscious Beatrice, and the music stops skipping and magically turns into a beautiful tune. It's a heartbreaking scene, showing how these truly were the only happy moments he ever had with his parents, more or less explaining why he turned to alcoholism to cope. On a couple of occasions, Bojack mentions his old TV show Horsing Around, commenting on how the real world simply doesn't work in the same way as it does on television, something that Bojack has, if anything, always struggled to realise. He notes that while TV often solves conflict between loved ones through big grand gestures, that no gesture can actually make up for years of emotional abuse, and that basic grand gestures are not enough to keep a relationship strong. And yet, while many toxic people do manage to keep their relationships going through empty grand gestures, the tragedy is Beatrice didn't even care enough about Bojack to try. The server girl who offered him the titular free churro had shown him more kindness in his 5 minutes of knowing her than Beatrice had shown him her entire life. Because ultimately, Beatrice never really wanted a relationship with Bojack. She instead felt more or less like she was trapped with him, and all her bitterness and resentment led to her doing all in her power to make him feel guilty and responsible for supposedly ruining her life. Even once she's dead, Bojack's eulogy features a good deal of self-deprecation, suggesting her words still have a deep-rooted effect on him. Bojack briefly comments on how Butterscotch died, in a duel with a critic who panned his novel that he was convinced would be a masterpiece. Bojack mentions on multiple occasions that Butterscotch clearly cared more about his novel than his family. And, well, it seems that as a result, Butterscotch's abuse and neglect had less of an effect than Beatrice's. this seems to tie into the conclusion of the eulogy. Bojack isn't so much as upset that his mother is dead, as he is upset that he will never have any kind of real relationship with her. While his hope for a relationship with Butterscotch was dead on arrival, part of Bojack wanted some affection from Beatrice. Beatrice proved she does have some maternal instincts when she started looking after her doll, and that she does have some kindness to her when it's revealed how she offered support to Henrietta despite her being pregnant with Butterscotch's baby. As horrible as Beatrice was towards Bojack, unlike Butterscotch, who lived and died as an entitled narcissist, Beatrice had some good to her, which, if anything, made her passing without any reconciliation even more devastating for Bojack, because the fact that the lighter side of her did exist only proves she actively chose to never show it to Bojack. The final moment of the episode ends on what is quite possibly one of the best jokes in the entire series, as Bojack decides to take his mother's "I see you" quote at face value and take one final look at her in her coffin, and then realises he has in fact entered the wrong funeral hall. As funny as it is, there is a deeper meaning to this. Not only does it show that given Bojack has spent the past 20 minutes telling his own story, peppered with references to his TV career without once realising he was speaking to the wrong crowd entirely, that in many ways he has inherited his parents' self-absorbed nature, but in a tragic sense it shows that even in death, he and Beatrice will never really be united. It is, in many ways, a perfect representation of this show. It's a deep, dark, tragic story about the bleak realities of life, hidden behind a surreal world and surreal comedy. Thanks for watching the video. I may well talk about this show again in future, since there are a lot of other episodes that I feel deserve their own analysis, like Time's Arrow or The View from Halfway Down. If you have a particular favourite episode of the show, be sure to let me know in the comments down below. And as always, like, share and subscribe, and donate to me on Patreon if you can, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.